parish of North Mymms has a long and exciting history. Many of the details are obscured by the mists of time, but fortunately much has been recorded and can be retold. Most of the names on this old map have survived today, although we may use a different spelling. The biggest village in the parish is Welham Green. It's now developed into a thriving residential community. It's said to be one of the largest industrial villages in Britain. The parish includes Brookman's Park, a modern residential area with some attractive properties. Close by are the tiny communities of Belbar, Water End, and the outlying communities of Little Heath and Bullen's Green. Within these areas, we are still fortunate to find many old buildings, monuments and reminders of the parish as it used to be. When the Normans conquered England, North Mymms had the delightful name of Mymmin. It came under the control of the Mandeville family, one of the cruelest in the land. Early in the 14th century, Simon de Swanland, a wealthy merchant from London, purchased 3/4 of the parish. The name Swanland lives on in Swanland Road and Swanley Bar. He was responsible for building a chantry at St Mary's, the parish church of North Mymms. The list of clergy goes back to medieval times. The parish of North Mymms covers some 5,000 acres. There were several large and important houses in the parish. The most important was the manor house of North Mymms. Others were Brookman's Manor House, Gubbins, Skimpans, and Potterells. Only North Mymms House has survived. Built by Sir Ralph Coningsby, who became Lord of the Manor of North Mymms early in the 16th century, the house has been much altered. New wings were added. They were later pulled down, and the original building has largely survived. It was the home of the Coningsby family until they sold the manor house in 1658. During World War II, part of the house was used as a Red Cross hospital for convalescent British soldiers and sailors. A large, separate American military hospital was built in the grounds of the house. After the war, these huts became a temporary housing estate called Hockey Lane. For many years, North Mymms House was the home of the Burns family, who threw the grounds open to the public once a year to raise funds for the Red Cross. In the blue dress, on the left, is Mrs. Burns, mother of Sir George. A beautiful feature is the Italian-style loggia. It was the rose garden that most people came to see. Sir George Burns, formerly Lord Lieutenant of Hertfordshire for 25 years, lived here until the death of Mrs. Burns, his mother, after which he moved to the nearby home farm. The Burns family provided the ground for the North Mymms Cricket Club, which is close to the farm. North Mymms House is, unfortunately, the only one of the great houses to have survived. Not far away stood Potterells, the home of the Coningsby family, who moved here from North Mymms Place. This is not the original house. The clock above what used to be called the Orange House has the date 1767 on its face, and this may be the clue to the date of the house itself. In the days before every household had a timepiece, the chimes of the Potterell clock served as the timekeeper for most of the village. older folk can still remember the attractive gardens when they were lovingly cared for. This drawing by Buckler in 1840 shows Pottrells from the water splash in Station Road. Among the families to live here were the Cotton Curtises. They were visited by Beatrix Potter, who recorded in her journal, "Went to afternoon tea. Didn't like the idea at first, but enjoyed myself. Potterells, an ugly house outside, but good in." Potterells is still there, but only just. After the war, while it was unoccupied, thieves stole the lead from the roof. No money was available to restore it, and the rain poured in. Gradually, the fabric rotted, and soon it will be just a pile of rubble. That's what happens all too quickly when nobody cares. The Cassamajors of Pottrells took a great interest in the affairs of the parish. It was Caroline Lydia Cassamajor who had a school built at Water End in 1847 and endowed it generously. Generations of girls and infants were trained here. Mrs. Cassamajor laid down exactly how much was to be spent on tapes, needles and threads for the girls. Some of the work done by the girls in 1897 is still around for us to admire. One of the school's many headmistresses was Mrs. Cook from Cumberland, who took over in 1902. An excellent teacher with boundless energy, she became a pioneer motorcyclist, travelling all over the country with her husband and writing articles for the motorcycling press. A succession of teachers taught the children down the years. The last was Mrs. Dorothy Colville, author of the delightful book North Mymms, Parish and People. There are many still living who owe their education to her and the Water End School. In 1960, Mrs. Colville retired and the school was closed. It was later demolished to make way for the widening of the A1 to motorway standards. The boys were taught until recently in Welham Green. Their school was built in 1887 on the site of the workhouse. Moving now to North Mymms' second largest village, Brookmans Park, it was this house, Brookmans, that gave it its name. The manor was held by a John Brookman at the beginning of the 15th century. Later the house was the home of Lord John Somers, one of the most influential men of the time. His last great political appointment was as President of the Privy Council in 1708. His memorial is in the parish church. The house was bought by Peter Gosen, a member of a Huguenot family, in 1786. For the next 140 years, the Gosen family were lords of the manor, playing a dominant part in the affairs of North Mymms parish. Robert William Gosen, the third Gosen to own Brookmans, lived here for 64 years, during which he expanded the estate until he owned more than 2/5 of the parish. Among the properties that he acquired was Gubbins, a fine mansion not far from Brookmans, the grounds of which added 365 acres to his lands. Gubbins stood on the site of a much older house, once the property of Sir John Moore, citizen of London and a judge of the King's Bench. He was the father of the martyr Sir Thomas More, author of the book Utopia, who was executed by King Henry VIII as a result of his opposition to the King's attempts to obtain a divorce. Thomas More, once Henry VIII's Chancellor, is commemorated in North Mymms in the St Thomas More Catholic Church at Welham Green, and in the naming of the secondary school at Brookman's Park, Chancellor's School. The old Moor Hall was replaced by a much finer house known as Gubbins. A wealthy young bachelor, Jeremy Sambrook, set about improving the house and the grounds. He commissioned Charles Bridgman, one of the great landscape gardeners of the day, to lay out the grounds. Bridgman created what was called a water garden, so beautiful that it became a well-known attraction. Its fame was such that Queen Caroline and 3 princesses came here in 1732 to view what were known as the waterworks. Folly Arch was built a little later. By this time, Sambrook had inherited the family baronetcy and had become Sir Jeremy. The idea of a structure like this was that it should look like a romantic ruin when seen on the horizon from the house. But the beauties of Gubbins and the gardens he had created could no longer be enjoyed by Sir Jeremy when, towards the end of his life, he became blind. He died in 1754 and was buried in St Mary's churchyard. Some 80 years later, the house and estate of Gubbins came up for sale. This modern copy of the agent's description of the property proves what a magnificent estate it must have been. Eventually a purchaser was found. It was none other than Robert William Gosen of Brookman's. For reasons that have never been understood, he proceeded to totally demolish the graceful old house. Since then, trees have grown up and completely obscured the place where it once stood. Almost nothing remains, except the lake created by Bridgman and Folly Arch, now a protected building. Strangely enough, the Gosens family's own house, Brookman's, did not long survive Gubbins. In 1891, while the family were away holidaying on their yacht, the house was being redecorated. A story is told that the painters were using a newly invented tool, a blow lamp, which set fire to the timbers below the eaves. Soon the whole house was ablaze. Only the foundations were left. The house was never rebuilt. Why? Nobody knows. The large stable block, which survived, was converted into the family home. Here, in the middle of what were the foundations, a lily pond was constructed, part of what was called a Dutch garden. This is how it used to look when the Gosen family lived there. The stable building that became the Gosens family home is now the clubhouse of the Brookman's Park Golf Club. But the destruction of the 2 great houses was not all loss. Where the gardens of Brookman's were once set out, golfers now have a beautiful course to enjoy, and the site of Gubbins has become an open space, owned by the parish council and enjoyed by all. This is the setting in which the modern commuter village of Brookman's Park grew up. Children now go to school, close to where the manor house of Brookman's once stood. But the name Brookman's Park became nationally known when the BBC's London radio transmitter was erected here. It was the first purpose-built transmitter capable of broadcasting 2 programmes simultaneously. The first programme went out in March 1930 and today 4 programmes are broadcast from here.
By Brian Morrison, Master Butcher. Jim's got a nice way with a song as well. More of your requests tomorrow, beginning at 9:30. Don't forget to write.
The old London 2LO transmitter, brought from Savoy Hill in London, is still preserved. It provided the first regular public radio programme in the world. The equipment used today is completely modern and many times more powerful. Another factor which helped to develop Brookman's Park as a residential area was the railway. Opposed by the Gosens and other landlords when it was first mooted, a station was added at Brookman's Park in 1926. Brookman's estates agreed to pay the railway an annual sum until 500 houses had been built. The station today plays an important part in making Brookman's Park a convenient place in which to live. But not all the houses in Brookman's Park today are modern. One that has survived from the past is Muffat's. It's more than 300 years old and has what's known as a mansard roof. It's often mistaken for a Georgian house. The sash windows and the way in which a parapet hides the roof are typically Georgian, but these features were added to bring it up to date in Georgian times. If we go inside, we find a fine staircase that is definitely not Georgian. It is typically Stuart, Jacobean in character. It's just like the one at Greenwich Observatory, built just after Charles II came to the throne. It's said that the nursery rhyme Little Miss Muffet originated here. The story goes that a Dr. Muffet, a pioneer in the study of spiders, lived here, and it was his daughter Patience who was referred to in the words, "Down came a spider and sat down beside her and frightened Miss Muffet away." But there's nothing in the deeds to suggest that such a man ever lived here. Perhaps it happened at Muffet's farm, just across the road. It's much older and may have been the home of the spider-loving doctor, after whom it appears to have got its name. It was saved from the threat of demolition when a preservation order was placed on it. It is, like Muffet's house and Folly Arch, a listed building. Between the wars, Muffet's became a school, a high-class establishment where boys were prepared for public schools. The old barn that is now St Michael's Chapel used to be the school's squash court, but when World War II broke out, the boys were evacuated to Devon. Muffet's became a school for evacuee children who were brought out here to escape the air raids that were expected to devastate London. It was now a far from posh school. Local children were allowed to attend as well, and the parents of one girl in the picture hastily removed her because they didn't approve of the behaviour of those awful children from London. There are other old houses in North Mymms. Skimpans, for instance, was recorded as early as 1434, but it's believed that this house is the home farm, and a much grander house once stood nearby. Perhaps it stood here, beside the present Skimpans. It must have been a fine large house. It was assessed for tax purposes as having 12 hearths in 1663 and was described as one of the most agreeable residences for a gentleman's family. The granary beside Skimpans has been restored. It stands on straddle stones and dates from the 16th century. This house, at Water End, is one of the few examples in the parish of Tudor jettying, the name given to the overhanging of upper stories so common in those times. It's still known as Mother Chuck's Cottage. Another old building is Lower Belbar Farm, renovated a few years ago and now revealing its 16th century characteristics in an attractive manner. Built in about 1540, this house is of English oak frame, with Elizabethan and Georgian noggin, with a peg-tiled roof. This attractive building used to be the vicarage. Parts of it date back to the 17th century. Here it is, back in 1896, in the time of the Reverend Batty. Welham Green has many interesting old houses. Crawford's Cottages, named after James Crawford, who occupied Pottrell's Farm earlier this century, date from the Tudor period and have changed little. Just along the road is the Hope and Anchor Public House. The photograph was taken by the village photographer, George Knott, at the turn of the century. He took many pictures in the parish, often identifiable by his bicycle, which he frequently included in the picture. In Dulsome Lane was Chuck's the bakery. Mr. and Mrs. Jonah Chuck delivered their bread, freshly baked on the premises, in a horse-drawn cart. The shop is still there, although it's no longer a bakery. Nash's Corner was named after the Nash family, who had their builder's yard there. Outside lay the oaks and elms, seasoning ready for use in building projects or coffin making. Another well-known building firm was Shadbolt and Nash. Many of their buildings can still be seen in the parish today. The single-storey shop, run by Miss Town, was sold to the Smithson family, and their son Esme started the first coach service in the village, running to and from St Albans. Later, a second storey was added, and 2 dwellings were built alongside. This road junction in Welham Green is still referred to as Balloon Corner, in memory of the first landing of a balloon in England. The balloonist was a young Italian named Vincenzo Lunardi, and he landed here in 1784. The stone tells of how he left his cat and dog, his flying companions that had become airsick, in the charge of a woman in the cottage on the corner, before continuing his flight. The charming clapboard cottage in nearby Station Road is the only one remaining of a number of similar wooden houses. The others were pulled down because they were considered to be a fire risk. Several cottages in Welham Green were built by Charles Coningsby Sibthorpe, and 2 of them in Station Road remind us of this fact. They carry the initials CCS and the date 1884. Woodbine Cottage in the same area dates from the 17th century. Fairview, unusual for its 3 storeys, was once the home of the Knott family. An interesting Georgian house is number 77 Bell Lane. It appears in this charming old drawing, sketched in the last century. The cottage on the right, with the tall chimney, is still there, but the chimney is not quite so tall, and a porch has been added. Nearly opposite is what used to be called the Iron Room, built as a mission hall by none other than Robert William Gosen of Brookmans. Meetings of the temperance movement were held here, a movement which flourished towards the end of the last century. Nearby, this house used to be a bakery. On the corner of Bell Lane and the Great North Road stood the Swan Inn, now a private house. It was a drover's inn, where the hunt used to meet. Many of the remaining public houses are very old. The old maypole claims to date from 1520. Inside, its great age is revealed. The Sibthorpe Arms, named after the Coningsby Sibthorpes, is old too. It has changed considerably during the last 100 years. There are a number of interesting old buildings on the outskirts of the parish. Hawkshead Farm includes parts of an old house probably going back to the 1500s. Hawkshead House was once the home of Lord and Lady Clawson. Now it's part of the Royal Veterinary College. Further up Hawkshead Lane is Osborne House, a graceful residence dating back to the early 18th century. The interior contains much that is in keeping. An item of great interest is a fireplace that is believed to have been rescued from Brookmans during the fire. It's a genuine example of the work of the Adam brothers, the famous interior designers. Burn marks were visible on it before it was lovingly restored by Mr. and Mrs. Teggin, the owners. Restoration takes many forms. Many things in the parish are still here only because people with a love of history have worked to save and restore them. Another example is this cottage. Much time has been spent removing rotten timbers and restoring the walls and roof to produce this delightful result. Abdale House, like Muffet's House and Muffet's Farm, might have been lost had a preservation order not been placed upon it. It's a listed building and is protected by law. Not only houses, old buildings like this Elizabethan barn are part of our heritage and deserve to be preserved for future generations to see. A lot of work and expense have gone into saving this fine old farm building. But not only old buildings are threatened. It's not long since modern Chancellor's School was under threat of closure by the County Council. But the people of North Mymms did not want their only secondary school closed. 700 people jammed the school hall in protest, and an action committee was formed. Car stickers were issued. Hundreds of supporters prepared to back their determination that chancellors must be saved. Parents attended council meetings in strength and filled the consultation meetings at the school. For 3 hours they voiced their objections to the chairman of the Education Committee. And they won. Chancellors was saved by the voice of the people, firmly expressed in unison. The countryside between Welham Green and Hatfield was threatened by a plan to build 1,700 houses. If it had been carried out, Welham Green would have become literally a part of Hatfield. Once again, public opinion was aroused and the plan was rejected. But North Mymms' beautiful open country and its woodlands are always vulnerable. Attack can come from the most unexpected quarters. For sale, grazing land and woodland. This announcement appeared suddenly. The woodland referred to as part of Gobian's Gardens, the lower woods, still privately owned. They contain the remains of much of North Mymms' history, including the old bridge, once part of the Gubbins Gardens, laid out by Charles Bridgeman for Sir Jeremy Sambrook, and the remains of the once famous water garden visited by Queen Caroline. Once again, a small band of concerned people got together and called a meeting to consider action. A majority agreed that if a developer purchased it, a serious threat could arise in the future, even though it was part of the Green Belt. A body called the Gobians Woodland Trust was formed. An appeal for funds was sent out to all householders in the vicinity. The message was, it's now or never. If the land isn't saved now, there will almost certainly never be another chance. As a result of community action, and a lot of intensely hard work, sufficient money was eventually raised to purchase the land on behalf of the people. The historic woods are in the hands of the local residents. Another battle has been won, but this time by a very narrow margin. The woods will be added to the other open spaces in the parish where people can enjoy themselves in our beautiful Hertfordshire countryside. What we all have to do is to look around us at any piece of undeveloped North Mymms, or any area that becomes threatened at any time, and ask ourselves and our neighbours, is this what you want? Whether the answer is yes or no, fighting for it will involve a tremendous amount of community effort and hard work. But, as we have seen, you can win. Chancellor's was saved. A green space still separates Welham Green and Hatfield. The Gobians woods have been kept from development, and there is still so much in North Mymms that is delightful and worth conserving.